Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Jay Parsons, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's webinar, Refining Our Nutrition Program to Meet the Mineral and Vitamin Needs of Our Sheep Flocks, with our presenter, Dr. Dan Moracle of Iowa State University. This webinar is brought to you by the Let's Grow Committee of the American Sheep Industry Association. We'd like to thank them for their support and encourage you to visit their website to learn more about the American sheep industry and to access the large volume of services and resources available from ASI to help you be successful in the sheep business. The URL for the ASI website is www.sheepusa.org. You can access the Let's Grow program materials by clicking on the Rebuild link under Programs on the main menu. You can also access those Let's Grow program materials directly by typing in the URL www.growourflock.org. I'd like to remind our listeners that this webinar is being recorded. All webinar registrants will receive a follow-up email within the next 48 hours that will have a direct link to the webinar recording as well as a link to the webinar slides. The links to these materials are also going to be posted on the Let's Grow website, along with the links to the recordings and slides from all of our past webinars. So if you've missed any of those and would like to go back and look at them, feel free to do so, including the webinar from Dr. Bob Van Zon that was mentioned in the abstract for this webinar here this evening. If you'd like to go back and look at that, it's posted there on the Let's Grow website. We are slated tonight for a 45-minute presentation, and then we'll have about a 20 or 25-minute question and answer session at the end. You don't have to wait till then, though, to ask your questions. Feel free to type them in at any time using the question box at the bottom of your control panel. I'll be monitoring those questions throughout the presentation and then moderating them to our speaker during the Q&A session. And as a side note for tonight, with nutrition questions, as many of you know, it's very helpful sometimes to know the location of the part of the country that you're in, and then maybe even like a sheep breed if that's relevant to your question. So if you can include that in the information, it will help our speaker address your question a little more directly. We also have the possibility of you talking directly with them if you have a fairly complicated question, and we can do that by connecting up to your microphone on your computer. So that's the first thing. You'd have to have a microphone connected, and then I'll walk you through the process on how to raise your hand during the Q&A session when we start that part of the program. So with all of that information out of the way, it's now my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Dan Moracle, Professor of Animal Science at Iowa State University. Dr. Moracle is a native of Indiana. After earning a bachelor's degree at Purdue University, he went on to earn both his master's degree and PhD in animal science from New Mexico State University in Las Cruces. In 1984, he joined Iowa State University as the Extension Sheep Specialist, and since that time, he's been responsible for their educational programs in all areas of sheep production and sheep management. He's also the principal researcher with the Iowa State University sheep flock. He's got a wide range of expertise that's well known throughout the sheep industry, but he's probably best known for his extensive work in the areas of sheep nutrition, forage utilization and range management, and sheep genetics. So really anything to improve the efficiency of sheep production. So tonight we're lucky enough to have him here to talk on our topic of refining our nutrition program to meet the mineral and vitamin needs of our sheep flock. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Moracle.
All right, thanks, Jay. And yes, I would also like to thank ASI for their support of this program. One of the things I did when I was an undergrad at Purdue was on the livestock judging team, so I do talk fast. And I'm not crazy about webinars because I can't see your faces and I can't tell whether you understood what I just said. I don't have too much twang and I talk fast, so we'll try to get that done. Make sure you get your questions in. And so here's my contact information. That's my phone number at the office and my email. So many of the questions we may not get to later tonight, I'll be glad to follow up with you directly on those. I will let you know that I'm going to be out of the office Thursday, Friday, Saturday at the Center of the Nation NSIP sale in Spencer, Iowa, where it's only going to be about 115 heat index. So I may melt into my shoes this weekend before we get done. All right, so the objective of supplementation is to provide for the animal's needs. We understand that feed costs are 50% or more of all of our feed costs, all of our costs. And so we want to try to keep those supplementation costs low. And the most important thing, one of the most important things I'm going to tell you all night is livestock do not read labels. So we as the shepherds, we've got to read the feed tags, we've got to read the feed labels, we've got to know what's in our feeds, know how much they're supposed to eat, and then monitor whether they're eating too much, not enough, and so we can know where we're at in terms of supplementation and trying to balance those sheep's needs. When we go right to minerals, we've got two different kinds. The minerals on the left, what we call macro minerals, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and sulfur. These are required on a percentages basis. So, for example, from 0.1% up to about 0.7% of the diet needs to be calcium, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and sulfur. The micro minerals are needed in very small quantities. Zinc, selenium, cobalt, copper, manganese, iodine, and iron. There's really no requirement for molybdenum other than to help counteract high copper levels.
Hey, Dan, I hate to interrupt you, but some people are having trouble hearing you. So if you could move a little closer to your mic, that would be helpful.
I got closer. How's that?
Okay, that's better.
Okay. And I thought I was talking plenty loud enough, but I can talk louder. Sorry, guys. Okay, so we got macro minerals needed on percent basis. Micro minerals are needed on parts per million or milligrams per kilogram. And so as we think about selenium is the prime example we talk about all the time, it's one of the micro minerals we really need to supplement in most cases. 0.3 parts per million. Okay, so if we think about the great state of Iowa, it has about 3.3 million people. So Dr. Moracle in the state of Iowa is equivalent, and that whole state population is equivalent to 0.3 parts per million. So with micro minerals, it just takes a little bit. And so we don't want to be adding it with a feed scoop. We need to make sure we're real careful when we're adding that amounts of micro minerals because we can get toxic levels pretty fast as well. All right, so your flock have a problem. And one of the challenges is as we look at this schematic, is we see the nutrient statuses of these minerals as it goes down over time if we're not supplementing. We can see some subclinical disease. The first thing, and lots of the micro minerals are, we'll see a reduction in immunity. So instead of a bacteria causing a little bit of problem in the sheep might get really sick. And you can see we see a reduction in growth and fertility. And then we see clinical signs. Classic clinical sign would be white muscle disease when we start thinking about selenium and the deficiency of that micro mineral. Then we see clinical diseases. From a fertility standpoint, if you've got less than 95% conception rate in your ewe flock, you should think about whether or not you might have a micro mineral problem that's causing those ewes to be open or abortion problem, because 95% of the ewes ought to land. This chart's really, really busy. What it's trying to emphasize is, specifically with copper down at the bottom, that high molybdenum levels, high sulfur levels, high iron levels all can interact to reduce copper's availability. Selenium is over here right underneath iron. We can see on selenium that if we go across with the
Dan, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
You're fading out quite a bit. You know how we had you hold real close to the microphone before? Yeah. Go ahead and speak now.
I'll see if that works better. That work any better?
Okay, go ahead and speak again.
Okay, I'm keep talking. And
right there.
Okay, right there. I can't move.
Okay.
Which is the other reason I don't like webinars, because normally I get up and pace around the room.
There you go.
Wave my arms.
All right.
All right. Okay, sorry about that, folks. Okay, so lots of these minerals interact. So here's a little bit when we think about copper as the example. If we have lots of iron, 200 to 400 level parts per million, it's antagonistic a little bit, but if we're over 400, so that's your hay field that's got lots of gophers in it, we can get into problems of being really antagonistic. Sulfur, as we've used it more and more with the distillers products from the ethanol industry, it's high in sulfur, so that also can screw up our copper, but it also screws up selenium. So we look at some data across Iowa on our beef survey of forages in 2010. Zinc levels by forage type were basically barely adequate in zinc. We're okay in manganese. We're short in copper in a couple cases. We got lots and lots of iron in that 300 to 500 category. That's feed with a lot, or hay with a lot of soil contamination. I just recently got back selenium on values, and we run somewhere between a tenth to 0.2 parts per million selenium. So we're short on selenium as well in Iowa, as is most of the country. Okay, critical times when those trace minerals are really needed is under stress, increases urinary excretion of copper and zinc. So stressful times in a sheep's life are weaning, transportation and shipping, if they're heavily parasitized, during lactation ewes are stressed nutritionally. So all of those times, if we're not getting enough minerals into them, the sheep cannot combat those stress as well. Reproduction, we need microminerals for conception and fetal development, including mineral storage in the liver of those fetuses, because minerals do transfer across the placenta, unlike most of the vitamins. And then our immune responses, if we're short, for example, on zinc and copper, our vaccination titer response, they won't get as good a titer, so they're not as immune after we vaccinate them, so it doesn't work as well. We still have some breaks, like on overeating disease, if we have failed to provide the microminerals. So the animal's needs, how much a sheep needs in terms of its minerals and vitamins depends on the stage of production. As we already talked about, if we've got high levels of iron, some of those other minerals are going to need to be supplemented more. The age of the animal, this is classic when we think about calcium and phosphorus. They're stored in the bones. And as we get into old ewes, their bones become much more brittle, and it's much harder for them to pull that calcium and phosphorus out of the bone matrix and use it to meet their needs. So we have to supplement those old ewes more. Level of production, whether that's rate of gain or milk production, ewes raising twins and triplets take more minerals than ewes raising a single because they produce more milk. So the example here comparing ewe lambs and a mature ewes on the microminerals for calcium and phosphorus. In early lactation, ewe lambs would need about 9 grams of calcium, whereas the adult ewes would need about 12, and that's because they're producing more milk. Phosphorus is about 8 grams on the ewe lambs and 11 on the adult sheep. Now, let's think about grams. There's 454 grams in a pound. Okay? So as we think about grams and the amount of, and these are macro minerals, and we still only need less than 10 grams. Or 10 to 12 grams. We don't need minerals in very high levels to meet the animal's needs. If we do the math on that lactating ewe, if I'm feeding her 4.5 pounds of alfalfa hay and 2 pounds of corn, and I know you guys have other sources of grain around the country, but this is Iowa and we grow more corn than anybody else, so I use all my examples with corn. Oats, wheat, barley, they all do the same thing. But at 4.5 pounds of alfalfa hay that's 24% as in 0.24% phosphorus, that's about 1/10 of a pound of phosphorus. 2 pounds of corn that is 0.35% phosphorus is 7/100ths of a pound. So I got 17/100ths of a pound of phosphorus in that ration times 454 grams per pound. So I'm giving her 7.7 grams in just her diet of corn and alfalfa hay. So to meet that needs for phosphorus during lactation, I need to give her some supplemental phosphorus. And normally we do that by feeding them a calcium phosphorus or a sheep mineral and let them free choice. The other option is to give her dical in the ration as the normal phosphorus source. So as we think about trying to meet my ewes' needs, part of whether or not I meet their needs is what the mineral consumption is. How much do they eat per day? Or how much do they eat in a week's time? Because they don't eat the same amount every day. I don't understand mineral intake and why sheep vary so much. I think some of it is the feed quality they get from other feeds. I think some of it's the moisture levels. Some of it might be the humidity, the temperature. Obviously, this week with the heat stress, they're going to drink more, they're going to eat more salt. But salt is what drives their intake. They are eating mineral to meet their salt needs. Okay? So we also notice as we look at feed labels on mineral tags, there are things like molasses, grain byproducts, maybe hay byproducts. There's lots of things added to that help improve the taste of the mineral, because many of the minerals are not very tasty. So if we didn't put some flavor enhancers in there, the sheep wouldn't eat very much. So if we get down here on mineral density, so we've got how much they eat, but then the density of the mineral is the other part that matters. In selenium, you'll find some sheep minerals that are only 10 parts per million selenium. The one that I use is 90 parts per million, but it's a trace mineral salt. And the amount of feed selenium we can give that sheep is controlled by the FDA. And we have a limit of 0.69 milligrams intake per day that we can give a sheep in terms of selenium. And I've already had some interaction with some clients that have signed up for this. I had questions earlier, and we've been working on their selenium problems. And one of the things I figured out as we started to do some investigation, we talk about interactions and various things. Those sheep were grazing on strip mine reclaimed pastures. I think there may be a lot of heavy metals available in that forage, and the heavy metals, like molybdenum, tend to reduce selenium absorption. And so I think that's why that flock was having their particular problem. So the mineral sources that sheep have available to them are the feedstuffs, and we went through the calculations on alfalfa hay. It's high in calcium. It's over 1% calcium. Sheep minerals, so if I go to the farm store, if I buy Kent, Purina, Blue Seal, sheep minerals, they tend to contain both macro and micro minerals. So in most cases, they're 10 to 12% calcium, 6 to 10% phosphorus, and the phosphorus content is one of the reasons why mineral is expensive. Dical is around $450 a ton. And then they vary it quite a bit on their salt intake from as low as 10% up to 35% salt. So if there's only 10% salt in that sheep mineral, they're going to eat a lot of mineral because the sheep, remember, are craving salt. That's what they're going after. And minerals are going to cost us somewhere between $20 to $50 a bag. Okay, depending on how many you buy, which store you buy it out of, how many sheep you got, and what you need to use. So this is an example mineral that a producer called me with from Kansas that they were feeding. 7% calcium, 5% phosphorus, 45% salt. Sulfur's 1%, magnesium 1%, zinc is 150 parts per million, which is short. below, and it's not going to meet their zinc requirements. It's okay in iron at 125. It's okay in cobalt, but it only had 10 parts per million selenium. And at 10 parts per million selenium, those sheep need to eat about 2 ounces a day. And that's way more intake than I think we can get out of them when we're at 45% salt to begin with. If I'm feeding this mineral with my alfalfa hay, I really don't need the calcium. Phosphorus, I probably don't need except maybe during lactation. And the high salt may result in low intakes that might not meet the ewe's needs. So from a mineral sources, here's the one that I feed. It's a trace mineral salt. It's 95 to 98% salt. If you bought groceries lately, had to buy table salt, it's really cheap. So the mineral's cheap. I pay about $12 a bag for this stuff. It only contains the micro minerals. So it's got zinc, it's got selenium, it's got iodine, hopefully it's got molybdenum. Let's see, it's got manganese, it's got cobalt, shouldn't have any copper. So because it's really high in salt, the sheep don't eat very much. They'll eat maybe a half an ounce to a quarter of an ounce a day. It's lower cost because it's mostly salt, and they eat about half as much as they would on a normal mineral. So on an annual basis, if I use trace mineral salt versus the sheep mineral, I think you can cut your mineral cost 20 to 25%. Now, I think many of you may be spending $20 a ewe on mineral per year. I think you might be able to get by with $5 or $6 or $7. So if you want to send me part of that money you just saved, that'd be great. I'm getting ready to retire in a year or two, and I need to build up my retirement account. And see, I try to make jokes, but when you're on a webinar, it's really, really tough to get a joke to go across. The other source of mineral is our water sources. So if you've got really hard water, that's high in calcium. If that water smells like rotten eggs, then you got a lot of sulfur. Sulfur would tie up again, back to tying up selenium, so you'd have more trouble with white mussel. So you got to know your local levels, and obviously if we've got lots of iron in there, that can also impact our mineral balance. Okay, why did I have this slide in here? Okay, this is the one I used. Big Gains Trace Mineral Salt. I think I messed up and duplicated the slide. It's okay in terms, but you'll notice it's got things in zinc at 6,000 parts per million. Notice this. If you're trying to convert from percentages to parts per million, you move the decimal place 4 digits. Okay, so I went from 0.6 to 6,000, from 0.5 to 0.52 to 5,200. So that's how you can make that quick conversion of percentages to parts per million. Multiply by, or move the decimal point 4 spots. Okay. Iodine is the problem, and this is mostly because the new NRC that came out in 1907, they increased the iodine requirement up to 0.8 part per million, and then realizing that under cold stress it's even higher, so that's a little short still. And selenium, they've maxed out the selenium level at 90 parts per million, and so that's a typical trace mineral salt. Okay, the other thing on the label, you'll notice this is from the trace mineral salt I just showed you, Big Gains. It has salt first. Normally it puts the feed ingredients in order of magnitude, first being the most in the diet. Sodium molybdate is the smallest. So they put vegetable oil in this, and that's to help hold down dust, keep it together, keep it mixed up, so that the minerals don't separate, don't sift out. They're adding calcium sulfate, magnesium oxide. The oxides are the minerals that aren't very tasty, zinc oxide as well. We're putting selenium in this particular example with sodium selenite. And then our dihydroiodide is our iodine source, and then we're adding sodium molybdate to help pull up reduce copper absorption. Now, here's the one that you all need to do. Read the feeding directions. I was using a mineral source once at our research farm, and the sheep were eating it like crazy. And we finally read the feed tag, and it said mix with salt 50-50. So it was really low in salt. We needed to mix more salt in to reduce intake. And once we did, then the sheep went back to normal intake levels. So you need to read the feeding directions. And so on this one, it's got a precaution against excessive consumption because, again, if we get above that 0.69 milligrams per head per day, we're feeding them too much selenium. And FDA's not happy, so we need to keep them at around 1/4 of an ounce of intake per day. So really, with the trace mineral salt, you should use somewhere around a pound a month, which would be 1/2 an ounce of intake per day, which is twice what they're supposed to get. So if we think about trace mineral salt, they shouldn't eat more than about 5 to 10 pounds a year, which is why it's a lot cheaper to feed them with a trace mineral than the normal mineral. Okay, so what should we do? If we want to streamline, fine-tune our nutrition program, we need to test forages. Send in our hay samples, get them run. It costs you $15 to test a hay sample. Get the macro minerals run on that so you know where your calcium and phosphorus levels are. And then you can go from there. Monitor our mineral intake. I like to put out a week's supply at a time. And we're thinking they need to eat 1/2 an ounce. In a week's time, that's 3.5 ounces. So it takes about a pound to feed 5 ewes. So that gives us an idea of how much to put out there. Again, reading the label, doing the math, putting out a week at a time. If they eat it too fast, you need to probably put out some extra salt. And if they are not eating it at all, there's something they don't like, whether it got wet, spoiled, caked up, couldn't eat it, whatever, because they should be eating about that amount. So when we go to selenium deficiencies, the big one on here is reproductive failure, so not getting our ewes bred. Embryonic mortality at weeks 3 to 4. So if we think about this, if we're watching our ewes during breeding season and getting breeding marks, those ewes that cycle every 30 days, every 35, 40 days, maybe they got pregnant, we lost the embryos at that 3 to 4 week time period, then she recycled 17 days later. White muscle disease is one we typically think about when we think about selenium deficiency, but the other issue is poor suckling reflex. The muscles in the tongue require selenium, so the lambs can't suck as well if they're selenium deficient. Indirectly, hypothermia is a problem with a selenium deficiency because we need selenium in a deiodinase enzyme, which converts I4 iodine to I3 iodine hormone, which is the biologically active form, which is the product that lets us break down that brown adipose tissue to help them keep warm. So if we're having a lot of trouble with hypothermia, and it's not that cold, maybe it's selenium problems. And then those, like we saw in that first graph, as we look about borderline deficiencies, we see some reduced growth. We might see some reduced disease resistance because selenium is part of our immune system. All right, wait a minute, went the wrong way. That was good. When we think about best management practices for selenium, read the mineral tag, monitor mineral intake. If you've got a flock with problems, I think you should consider force feeding your mineral. Switching minerals doesn't necessarily do that. We have ewe to ewe variation in intake. Some ewes eat too much, some ewes don't read the label and they don't eat any or very little. And if you force feed it in a grain mix, then you know they're all getting a pretty uniform daily dose. I've had many people say that they only put out the good mineral in late gestation and lactation and a little bit during breeding season. I think we need that mineral year-round to help the animals fight off parasites, bacterial diseases. So I think we need to always have our mineral source out for the sheep. Be aware that if the old adage, if some is good, more is better, does not fit with minerals. Selenium can be toxic at 2 parts per million. And so basically we've got about a 10-fold variance from what they need versus what's going to get us in problems with toxicity. And then again, as we've already mentioned, selenium or high sulfur can decrease our absorption, and we've had some problems with guys feeding a lot of distillers in their lactation rations to get the protein up, and that high distillers product is our products high in sulfur, and they were seeing some selenium deficiency white muscle in those disease in those nursing lambs. And then, as I mentioned, one of the clients that's already talked to me about their flock and having trouble with selenium, I think it's heavy metals that may be interacting and antagonizing selenium absorption, and that's why they're having deficiencies with molybdenum, cadmium, arsenic, and some of those that are maybe available on those strip mines. Okay, iodine. This is a new one. We typically think about iodine only in terms of goiter. As I said, the NRC raised that requirement to 0.8 parts per million. So most of our mineral sources are short. Then we need to be at 140 parts per million in the mineral on iodine with a half an ounce of intake to get enough into them. What we have started doing is free choicing iodized salt in late gestation to get more iodine intake into those sheep. What we were seeing were a lot of lambs born dead, stillbirths, and we have pretty well eliminated that problem with going with iodized salt in our particular flock using the trace mineral salt. Copper toxicosis. Copper poisoning is our most common mineral toxicity for sheep in the Midwest. Iowa especially, their breed susceptibilities are a problem. Suffolk sheep are really good at absorbing copper in their gut. So it doesn't take much copper to get a Suffolk sheep poisoned. As we talked about, mineral interactions of molybdenum and sulfur. Both of those will reduce copper absorption. I had a client that I've been working with that has a copper toxicosis problem going right now on 500 head of sheep because they used a beef product that was 1,000 parts per million copper, only fed it for 3 weeks and had copper problems. So never use beef minerals, beef products, beef rations for sheep. They're just too high in copper. And definitely don't use poultry or swine rations because they're even worse. So our problem in Iowa is we have normal copper levels at 8 to 10 parts per million, but we have very low molybdenum levels, and I have trouble getting that out of my mouth, so be careful. So we think about preventing copper toxicosis. Prevention is use sheep-specific feeds. Do not feed additional copper, and then feed some molybdenum, but remember that both are toxic. I have a client that I've worked with on strip mines. His molybdenum levels were 6 parts per million. In Iowa, we're at about 0.5. So he had 30 times more molybdenum than we normally see. And I had to balance some rations that contained 40 parts per million copper. Now that made me shiver from a liability standpoint because if I fed 40 parts per million copper to my sheep in Iowa, they'd be dead with copper toxicity in 30 days. So when we think about copper and molybdenum, we want that ratio of 6 to 1 up to 10 to 1. So 6 parts copper, 1 part molybdenum, up to 10 to 1. So in Iowa, we hope that that molybdenum that we're adding through the trace mineral salt gets our diet up to 1 part per million molybdenum, so we can handle about 10 parts per million copper to prevent any copper poisoning situations. And the problem with copper toxicosis is the copper accumulates in the liver over time, and it may take 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 3 months of high copper intake. And then we put a stress on those sheep, ship them to market, sell them in a sale as breeding stock, sort our ewe lambs out of the fat lamb pen and put them out on pasture to grow them through the summer, and they'll break with copper. So those stresses then make them break. If you don't know what copper poisoning signs are, those sheep will have bloody diarrhea. When we look at their eyeballs, they'll be yellow, they'll be jaundice. If you cut one of the ones that dies open, the body fat will be yellow, or what the veterinarians call icterus, and it's a classic sign of copper toxicosis. All right, so we're going to move on to vitamins. There are 2 kinds of vitamins as well. We've got the fat-soluble vitamins, which are A, D, E, and K. Vitamin A is involved with night blindness. It's also involved with reproduction, retained placentas. The rule of thumb is if sheep have grazed on green grass in the past 6 months, they've gotten enough green chlorophyll, basically grass, in their system, they've stored enough vitamin A in the liver, they don't need to be supplemented. So if you're in a drought environment or you're a high-tech desert, you don't ever have any green grass to feed those sheep, or very little green feed, you may need to supplement vitamin A all the time. Vitamin D is involved with our calcium and phosphorus metabolism. Classic signs of vitamin D deficiency are rickets. If our sheep have access to sunshine, they can generate their own vitamin D through the skin, so we don't have to supplement. Vitamin E is white muscle and immune issues that we've talked about because it's part of our immunity system. It's part of our, when we think about white muscle, that's really a problem with free radicals that are not denatured in the muscle as the animal's tissues are active. Vitamin E needs to be fed. If the sheep are dry lotted, under pasture, green grass, spring grass is really high in E. It goes down a little bit through the summer months. It's not as concentrated. But generally, if they're on green pasture, green grazing, we don't need to supplement E as well. And then vitamin K is for blood clotting. The good news is the body can synthesize that unless we've got some things in our diet that are screwing that up. But most of the time, we don't have to worry about vitamin K. Going to the right side of this slide, B vitamins and vitamin C. B vitamins are what we call water soluble. Generally, there is no concern on B vitamins as long as we have a healthy rumen, because the rumen microbes can synthesize B vitamins, and then the sheep, as the microbes go down through the gut, digest the microbes and gets the B vitamins from the microbe source, so they're okay, and sheep can synthesize their own vitamin C. So in all reality, if we've got green pasture, and sheep have exposure to sunlight, the only thing we really need to worry about if they have a healthy rumen is vitamin E. Now, all the vitamins we get, vitamin A, D, and E come in a premix, so we add them all. They're relatively cheap. You can buy a bag of A, D, and E premix for about $25, and you need to add 1 or 2 pounds per ton. So it's not an expensive thing to add more vitamins to your ration. And we'll go through how much here in just a second. So if we think about vitamins that are listed on our feed tag of our mineral sources, those oxides, those minerals can deactivate the vitamins during their storage. My mineral specialist here at Iowa State University projects that the half-life on the vitamins in a mineral bag are somewhere between 14 and 21 days. What that means to us is if I started with 100 parts per million or 100 international units of E in that mineral per pound, in 21 days I'm down to 50. In another 3 weeks I'm down to 25, and in another 3 weeks I'm down to 12. So if it's stored more than about 90 days, I don't expect there to be any vitamin activity in our mineral. So we cannot count on that mineral to provide our vitamins from what the feed company puts in for us. And a lot of times you'll see on the feed tag, the mineral tag, it'll have 10 international units of E per pound. I want those used to get 100 international units of E per day, which would mean they have to eat 10 pounds of mineral, which we know they cannot do. So if that was 1,000 international units per pound, then we'd be talking about something that might meet the sheep's needs as it comes to us in the feed bag. So from vitamin E, it's white muscle disease. What vitamin E and selenium interact. The more vitamin E we have, the less selenium we need. One can spare the other. It helps with oxidative stress and free radicals. And I know we don't want to talk about biochemistry, but that's what nutrition is. So you can think about a free radical being in the muscle. It's basically as that muscle does its thing, it metabolizes nutrients. That's a byproduct of the energy metabolism. It's kind of like lactic acid that builds up when you exercise and makes your muscles sore. This is kind of the same deal. It's a peroxide free radical, so it's an O2 compound. And so the selenium and vitamin E help get rid of that and get it out of the system, convert it over to water. And so if we think about accumulation, it creates cell muscle damage. And when we think about white muscle, those lambs stand all hunched up. They act like they're stiff and sore, and that's because their muscles hurt because of that muscle damage. It's just like if I went and jogged a mile tomorrow, I would hurt because I don't normally do that. And so I'd strain those muscles, over-exercise them, and I'd be really sore until I got rid of that lactic acid. All right, so late gestation. It's stressful for our sheep. When those used are in late gestation, that reduced immunity can cause them to suffer problems. Cold stress, because we normally use ahead of lambing. Milk fever is a problem of inadequate calcium or too much of other minerals. Need to try and make our cation anion imbalance corrected. And so as we think about, especially those of us that use alfalfa hay, we put a lot of potassium on those fields. Potassium is a positive cation or anion, so it's plus charge. Calcium's a plus charge. We don't have enough negative charges, and that's what gets us in trouble, especially in the dairy industry. So if you're having a lot of trouble with milk fever, you need to kick your calcium up and look at ways to reduce some of those other products. And then as we think about that stress and late gestation, when we are fighting stress, that reduces our immunity, which leads to more health issues, which could be mastitis, could be respiratory, could be uterine infections. And the other problem with reduced immunity is when animals are trying to fight off a disease, launch that immune challenge response to a challenge, they're reallocating nutrients. So it can't go to milk production, it can't go to growth. So we need to make sure that we get enough microminerals into these sheep so we can maximize their immunity. So we think about selenium. Here's the research results that we did at Iowa State a long time ago. We were giving ewes a shot of vitamin E every week. We gave them 3 cc's of vitamin E that had 300 international units of E in it. So we gave them a total intake per week with a shot of 900 international units. So if we look at pretreatment levels, 1.27 is the serum E level, and those controls, E gestation reviews that got pin cushioned every week. They're the same pre-treatment, which makes sense. That helps science. Pre-lambing after 4 weeks of treatment, the controls went up as well because we fed them a little more feed, but not as much as our treated ewes, almost a 2. We would say anything less than 1.0 would probably be classified as deficient. The new NRC wants maximum levels at 2. I think you got to feed a lot of E to get to 2. So post-lambing, the control ewes dropped to 9.3. Mid-lactation, they were 9.7. And their milk production at 3 days post-lambing was 10.8 on IU activity in the milk. Whereas the treated ewes in late gestation we treated, their milk was 50% higher in vitamin E. So that extra E that we had in the ewes, they put it in the milk, so that fed the lambs better. Over here on the right, we have ewes that were treated in lactation only. So we took half the controls and put them on E and lactation. And then this column are ewes that had E in both gestation and lactation. You can see if we keep treating the ewes, we keep that E level quite high. Now, here's the important thing to remember. These ewes are on excellent alfalfa hay. It's second cutting and shelled corn. So they had really good feed, but we were still short on E and we needed to supplement. On the lambs that they were raising at 3 days post-lambing, at 3 days of age, they're all good on E. These control lambs and ewes that never got any E and the ewes that only got it in late gestation and then we quit, you'll notice their serum E levels at 28 days are very, very low. Excuse me. Whereas if we supplemented the ewes, the lambs' E levels, serum E levels were very high. So we need to feed these ewes some extra E in lactation. And by about 35 days, probably they ate enough creep feed that they're probably okay. But getting them from birth to 35 days is the challenge, which is when we see most of our white muscle disease. So best management practices on vitamin E. I would feed my ewes 100 IUs of vitamin E per head per day in late gestation and lactation. My creep feed, I would try to fortify it with at least 40,000 international units of vitamin E per ton. And you could go all the way up to 100,000. 100,000 international units of E will cost you about $5. So when we think about creep feed running $300 to $500 a ton, that's pretty cheap. As I mentioned before, don't count on vitamin E in the mineral. The concentration's too low. For those of us that are listening tonight and we've got our ewes out on grass 3 or 4 weeks ahead of lambing and they're pasture lamb or range lamb that are eating green feed, you don't need to worry about vitamin E supplementation because there's plenty out there and everything should be fine. Okay, so let's think about what we can do to attack some problems. If we think we have problems, both the kidney and liver are excellent organs to evaluate in terms of their mineral composition. So if you got some lambs, you happen to run over a lamb with a skid steer when you're cleaning the barn. If you look at his kidney and liver, that'd be a lamb that wasn't ever sick, so it ought to give you an idea where your normal levels are on your farm. Sampling the forages again, because they vary by region of the country. They vary by what they've been fertilized with. Each trace mineral will cost you around $35 to $50 per sample. So I don't want to do a lot of sampling, send in a lot of samples, but I might want to test what I think my problem is. So if I think selenium is my issue in my farm, I might send in a hay sample for selenium. I might also think about checking it for molybdenum and sulfur because those interact. Again, back to reading the mineral tags, monitoring intake. We did a NOM study of sheep people about 10 years ago, and about 50% to 60% of the people were just using plain salt as their mineral supplementation, and we've got to get that done. and gets those micro minerals in there, because then our immunity is better, our growth and performance and reproduction is better. Sheep have zero nutritional wisdom. We have to be the nutritionist. We're their caretakers. We've got to read the labels. We got to read the fact sheets. We got to take the hay samples, send it into the lab. And lastly, consult a nutritionist that can help you do the math, balance the rations to make sure things are good. So if I'm on my farm, I told you the vitamins aren't any good in the mineral, but if I've got 50 ewes that I'm free choicing mineral to, and they eat a half an ounce a day, and I bought some AD&E that's 2 million A, half a million D, and 4,000 at vitamin E, and then you can buy vitamin E as well at 20,000 IUs. Ewes need about 3,500 IUs of A per day, and they need about 150 to 300 IUs of E. And we're going to try to supplement them at least 100. So what we can do is half an ounce times 50 head times 7 days. That flock of 50 ewes on a half an ounce of mineral intake is eating about 11 pounds of mineral a week. So the product I showed you was a Kent AD&E premix that you could buy for about 50 cents a pound to 75. So it takes 7/10 of a pound of AD&E and 2.5 pounds of vitamin E. So if I mix that with my 10.9, I've gotten 3,800 IUs of A into that U, 960 of D, and 138 units of E. So that 3 pounds of supplementation cost me $3 for my 50 ewes for a week. So it cost me about $3 for the ewes per year to get AD&E into those ewes. Now, on this mineral recipe, I mix it up every week, because the longer that premix of AD&E is in with the mineral, the more it is denatured. So I don't want to mix up more than about a week's worth at a time. Keep the AD&E premix dry. Store it in a garbage can. It should last you for years and be ready to go as long as you keep it dry and feed it up. So a bag of that will last you over a year for your sheep flock with 50 ewes. Now, we're going to do this. We got to have a good set of scales. And this is one I pulled off the internet. This scale, you can buy all these diet scales to weigh out our AD&E, and it costs you all of about $15 to $20. All right, so I don't know whether I talk too fast, whether I talk too slow, but I got through all the slides really quick. And so we'll take questions.
Yeah, we've had a lot of them come in here, so we'll jump right into them.
All right, so I'm going to go back to the first, but you want the first slide up, okay?
Yeah, that's fine. I kind of got them grouped together here, so I'll try to hit you with them in groups. Just a reminder to our listeners.
Oh, that's not good.
To our listeners, if you want to speak directly to Dr. Moracle, you can raise your hand.
Am I gone? Am I still there?
Yeah,
Hello.
Dan, I can hear you just fine. Are you there, Dan? Dan? Hold on just a second. I think we lost. He can speak, but he can't hear us.
Jay, am I there? Hello.
Yeah, yes, you're here.
1, 2, 1, 2.
I can hear you just fine, Dan.
Oh, this is not good. I don't know whether anybody can hear me or not.
Yes, we can hear you just fine, Dan.
Jay, can you type questions and I can see them, or send me an email if you're hearing me?
Yes, I'll just put them in the chat box here. I'm not sure what you hit, but you unplugged your speakers.
Test 1, 2, test.
Dan.
Can you hear me, Jay?
Yeah. Okay. Well, sorry about that, folks. Not sure what he hit. Let's do it this way. Okay, Dan, are you there?
Can you hear me, Jay?
Yes, I can. Dan, I can. Are you there?
Test 1, 2, Jay, can you hear me? All right, this is not good. I think Jay died.
Can you hear me okay? Jerry. Hold on just a second, folks. Let me get Dan on the phone here.
Yeah, Jerry. Okay. All right. All right. We're hooked up, people. Just a small glitch. We're ready to go. Okay. Yes. Probably it does. They feed chickens a high level of copper. Depending on how much manure you put on, you're probably elevating the copper levels in the forage that comes off of that field. So I would say you're increasing the risk. Again, I would get some samples run on the forages off of those fields to see what the copper levels were, because you can feed high copper feed, but you got to match it with high molybdenum. So you got to do some specific alterations to the diet. Okay. I probably need to repeat the question so everybody can hear it. Yep, I'm good. I have no information whether hair sheep are better or worse at absorbing copper. So I would assume they're similar to wool sheep, and would be very careful. Yes, we can have, the question is, I don't know whether you can hear Jay guys, so I'm going to repeat them. The question is, can I have a copper deficiency? And yes, we can. We're feeding too much sulfur. We can get into problems that way. If we're feeding, have high molybdenum like that gentleman in Ohio on the strip mines where he had 6 parts per million molybdenum, those high molybdenum levels, we can get into copper deficiency. Normally, our base diets should be in that 7 to 10 parts per million copper, so we should be okay as long as we don't have too much molybdenum or too much sulfur. Okay. Okay, so the question is, how long does that vitamin E stay in the body? It gets used up pretty quickly. Those use, if we weren't like on that research trial, we were given 900 international units a week. I would have expected within 2 weeks after we quit that vitamin E level, the supplementation would all be gone. We did a trial once where we were doing some A and E work on reproduction, and we brought ewes in off pasture in August. And those ewes, their E levels dropped right down and were pretty low without supplementation within about a month. So it's relatively quick that E goes away. Okay. I don't think there's any scientific data that shows that. There was one little study that North Dakota State did with rams where they thought they saw some impairment on semen quality on rams on the first year. When they repeated that study year 2, they did not see any effect. So I don't think there's any problem with distillers per se, unless it's high in sulfur, and that high sulfur level might screw up your selenium levels and selenium status, so that you could get into a deficiency of selenium and then you get into reproduction. So it's a 2-step process. Okay, so the question is, what's lacking when I only have singles? Some of whether the ewes have singles or twins depends on what time of year you breed them. If you breed them during the normal breeding season, breed in October when they should have the most twins. Genetics, it's lowly heritable, but it is heritable. The older ewes tend to have more multiples. And as we talked about, normally on sheep, we do have embryo loss, we have fetal loss. We do see some embryo losses with selenium deficiencies, but I think those ewes would lose all their lambs, not just go from a twin to a single. Normally, I think it's new energy more than anything else. The ewes have to be in good body condition, rising plane of nutrition going into breeding to try to get more multiples. And I didn't answer that question, but that's okay because there is no answer. There's lots of pieces, but no one thing. Yes, the selenium organic complexes with an amino acid are more biologically available because they're better absorbed. But they're also way more expensive. So you got to weigh the potential benefits of improving. If you're already using the maximum level you can feed and you're still having selenium problems, then you probably need to go to organic selenium source. But if you're not maximizing selenium intake with the non-organic sources, then I'd try that first because it's cheaper.
Okay, and then a question on chelated mineral. Are chelated mineral better than
chelated minerals?
Chelated. Sorry, it's not my.
Chelated. It's okay. It's all right. You're not a nutritionist, Jay. I forgive you. It's okay.
Are chelated
okay,
mineral?
So chelated minerals are what we're kind of talking about, in that they're complexed with an amino acid. They tend to have better absorption rates. So instead of like 35% absorption, there may be 45, 50% absorption. So you get a little more bang for your buck.
Okay.
But they are more expensive.
Okay, so if your herd looks healthy, you've had a great lambing season, everything looks good, how much should you give minerals, or what is the first sign that you may need some?
Okay. So if I have, and I had a good lamb crop and my death loss is less than 10% from birth to weaning, they grew okay, the ewe lambs breed at a year of age and lamb at a year of age. If all those things are happening, I probably wouldn't worry about doing extra mineral supplementation. I wouldn't change what I'm doing because what you're doing is working really good. I'm not that lucky.
Okay.
Or else my sheep aren't that good. I have to fiddle with mine a lot more.
Okay, a question from Wheat Country, Kansas. It's inexpensive.
Okay.
Wheat is inexpensive right now because of low commodity prices, obviously, and a good wheat harvest. Can whole wheat, hard red winter wheat, be fed to ewes or lambs on feed? And any concerns there?
The concern is you probably don't want to be above, and the question was how much wheat can I feed because it's cheap right now.
Yes.
Its energy density is equal to corn or maybe a little hotter than corn, and it's a little higher in protein. Generally, the recommendation on wheat is to coarse crack it. You don't want to get it very fine because you can dough up in the rumen, and we don't normally go above 50% wheat in the ration because it's a little too doughy, too hot a feed.
Okay. There was a point towards the end there where you're talking about mixing in the different vitamins, A, D, and E in particular, and I think you said
Yep.
mix it into salt. And
Mix it into your normal mineral.
normal mineral.
So when we're supplementing A, D, and E, we would add it into what mineral you are already feeding on a weekly basis. So you figure out how much your sheep eat in a week's time, you mix in the A, D, and E to go with it, and that way you can get A, D, and E into the ewes without, especially like if you're running them all in pasture all the time, so you're not graining them,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't have any way to feed that E, you can mix it in the mineral, but only a week's worth at a time.
Oh, this is a good question. Is there a difference between high-price mineral and cheaper mineral when you compare them on the tag, and they look the same, obviously? Knowing the amount of salt affects prices. Anything else they should look at there? In other words, is mineral.
Generally, mineral. What mineral we really need to worry about? Selenium. But again, back on the mineral, it is if they have the same salt content, they should have about the same intake per ewe per day or per head per day. And so I would feed the cheaper one. But again, it has to have, depending on what your base ration is, it needs to have other things to mix with it. So you can make the things balance. Okay. Normally, okay, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish what you're saying there.
Well, normally what I would say is at least the forage samples in Iowa have adequate calcium and phosphorus. We really don't need to supplement those. Obviously, as we go west in the range country, drier environments, phosphorus supplementation becomes more important. So you might be able to get by in the Midwest east with just a trace mineral salt on cool season grasses. Whereas you get into range country, you still may need to use the macro minerals as well. They need to be supplemented. So we're feeding sheep all over the country on this webinar tonight. You need to talk to your state specialist, local, what minerals tend to be deficient in forages in your state. And then we can balance our needs from there.
Okay, question. They said the first mineral mix you mentioned, which I think would have been the tag that you had up there.
The Kansas tag?
Yeah, they asked, would that calcium level cause problems for rams or wethers?
I didn't talk about that. I didn't talk about urinary calculated tonight. Okay, right there. Ideally, for our rams, we don't want to feed in extra phosphorus. So that might get us into trouble, especially if we're already graining those sheep. Because at 5%, you're picking up every pound they just don't eat much mineral anyway, so it's not like you're adding a lot in there. We definitely wouldn't want to feed a finishing ration that was 5% phosphorus because they'd all plug up and die of urinary calculi. But it's only a small percentage of their intake, so you gotta keep that in mind. Half an ounce out of eating 4 or 5 pounds a day.
Okay, somebody with some lighter weight ewes, they currently average only 50 pounds in weight. How do I adjust the mineral vitamin amounts for them?
I'm trying to see if I have a good answer for that. I think we'd have to do the math and extrapolate it down. I would look up vitamin requirements for a 100-pound ewe and use those, and mineral as well, because I don't think anybody's done the data with 50-pound ewes.
Okay, question from the Southeast. They say that they have, some of the wool sheep they have seem to be more susceptible to worm stress with high heat and humidity. Are there any mineral vitamins that will specifically help with this problem?
So the question was, in the Southeast, under their parasitism problems, the wool sheep seem to be getting hammered worse. Is there anything I can do from a mineral standpoint to help them fight that off? And now, in reality, I think the thing that you need to think about doing is make sure you meet the ewe's protein needs. Because if she's protein deficient, her antibody production's not good, and she can't ward off parasites as well. And especially if those wool sheep are lactating, they are under nutritional stress. They're protein deficient. Especially get in the Southeast, you get into that summer feed that's not very good in terms of its protein content. So I would make sure I got some supplemental protein into them: soybean meal, peanut meal, cottonseed meal, distillers, corn gluten meal, all of those, any of those sources.
Okay, and a question from somebody that has ewes and lambs in confinement. Would it be better to supplement vitamin A and E through mineral or through feed? The diet is currently alfalfa, corn silage, whole corn, and dried distiller grains. What levels of E and A should a guy supplement?
Okay, so if I'm in a confinement system where I'm taking the feed to the sheep in a TMR with corn silage and alfalfa hay, I would always force feed my A, D, and E. I would force feed my minerals as well. I'd give them exactly what the label says. So if the user's supposed to get a half an ounce a day, I'd put a half an ounce in the mineral or in the TMR ration, because you'll get more uniform consumption from ewe to ewe. They don't waste any. They get exactly what they need. And I would balance everything and feed it to them. And then the only thing I would provide those ewes, I'd probably give them a free choice salt block just to help with their boredom and give them something to chew on.
Okay, somebody based in northeastern Oregon said it sounds like mineral nutrition issue is pretty customized based on multiple factors. Is that why we can't find any mineral blocks, whether salt, trace mineral with selenium, etc., specific to sheep versus all the blocks that are available for cattle?
I think it has to do with the size of the industries, that there's just not as much demand for sheep products. I know at least of one vet supply house that sells a premix that you can order and then mix it with plain salt to make a trace mineral salt. Normally we could do that and then add dical to it to get calcium and phosphorus in, and we'd have everything we probably need for the use. So we can do some things that way. They could try to look for one of those type of products in their region.
Okay. And we'll try to get in a couple more questions here. One of them is, we use white salt due to high iron. The sheep are out on pasture. Do we need to supplement other than salt?
Yes. But I also don't know where they at. What part of the country?
They did not give a location.
They didn't say. Okay.
Yeah.
Salt alone is not enough.
Okay. Next question. We had 2 lambs born this past spring who were constipated. We never had a problem before. Is this likely due to mineral imbalance of the mother? All ewes were fed the same mineral mix.
Okay, well, on baby lambs, there are 2 issues that we can have happen. One is there is a phenomenon known as atresia ani, which means they have no rectum. So you can't fix those sheep. They're going to die. That's a genetic defect. I don't think there's anything we can do to fix that. I don't think it's a mineral issue. I think it's just weird stuff. Okay? The other constipation issue is normally what I see when lambs are constipated with that first meconium fecal material, that real dark, tarry first manure, it's normally lambs that didn't get enough colostrum because the colostrum has got lots of fat in it, and that fat helps them poop. So what we have to do is give those lambs an enema and get that flushed out of them so they can get their digestive system working and flowing through, and they'll pick right up and get right after it. So I don't think it's a mineral problem. I think it's a lack of colostrum intake. So normally I see that in triplets and quads because they had to share too much colostrum with their brothers and sisters and they didn't get enough.
Okay, another vitamin E question for grazing ewes then. Vitamin E is not stored in the body to last throughout the winter? I think that was the tail end of your vitamin E comment.
Yes, and that would be absolutely correct. Vitamin E is not stored in the liver. Vitamin A is, but not vitamin E. So they've got to have a normal daily, weekly vitamin E source. And vitamin E does not cross the placenta, so it doesn't go from the ewe to the offspring.
Okay.
It does go into the milk and then the milk into the lamb, and that's what gets the E status up. That's why we need to supplement those ewes heavy in like late gestation so that their milk has lots of E, so we get lots of E into the lambs.
Okay, just a couple more questions in. One of them is on phosphorus. Is it totally unnecessary or not?
The only time, well, okay. Now again, it goes back to your forage source and what the base phosphorus level is. But generally, other than lactation, most of the time we can meet phosphorus with alfalfa hay and shell corn or other hays. Now, if we're feeding some forages that are really low in phosphorus, like 0.1% instead of 0.25, then we're going to have to supplement more. So again, it goes back to we can do a forage test, get the idea of what the phosphorus level is. It's relatively cheap at $15, $20, and then we know whether to supplement or not and how much to supplement.
Okay. And two questions that I'll just group together here for the last. The location is Northeast Oregon. We are able to raise alfalfa as primarily hay. What are the pros and cons of feeding straight alfalfa versus a grass hay or grass alfalfa mix? And then when you're done addressing that, somebody else asked, does pelleting feed degrade the minerals in the feed? So if you'd like to address those two.
Okay, so the first question is, which hay should I feed, alfalfa, alfalfa grass, or grass hay? All three can be utilized. They need different supplementation. The alfalfa hay tends to be higher in protein. It may actually be too high in protein, so that the sheep may actually have to spend energy to get rid of the excess nitrogen, which they basically pee out in their urine as urea, and that's what gets converted to ammonia and makes our barns stink. Normally, grass hay, if it's put up in the right stage of maturity, can be excellent feed. It tends to get a little ranker, a little more mature, less energy dense as it gets more mature, so it's not as good a feed that way. It's hard to look at a hay, whether it's alfalfa or grass, and tell what the energy density is. And it's more variable. That's why we need to test. And then going back to pelleting, Minerals are never destroyed by pelleting or heat. Some of the vitamins may be deactivated during the pelleting process because they get very hot. Minerals get complexed with each other, like the copper and molybdenum. They form complexes, so they may not get absorbed. They're still there. Now, when forage stands out all winter and it gets snowed on, rained on, you can leach some of the mineral out. We don't leach all of the mineral out. So it'll be a little less, but it's not completely gone. So weathering causes minerals to get solubilized and rinsed out of the feed, but it's not pelleting. Storage doesn't really do that.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for a great presentation, and thanks all our listeners for their patience as we work through that little audio issue. But lots of good questions, and we really...
I was sweating bullets on my end, I know that.
Well, I could hear you fine, and everybody could hear...
I thought I did something wrong here. That's why I was nervous, but I didn't know what I had done.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what happened, but anyway, we got her figured out. So thank you, everybody, for being on tonight. We do have another webinar upcoming on August 30th. Reed Redden will be with us to talk about the best practices to increase your lamb crop. So that's the next one that we have on the schedule, and so look for that advertisement coming out very soon. But I'll just end with saying thanks for everybody for coming out tonight, and thank you, Dan, for your time and expertise and sharing it with all of our audience.
You're very welcome, Jay. Thank you.
Okay, everybody have a good evening.